All right, let's dive into Calming the Storm by Peter Adler. You shared some interesting pieces from it, and it seems like this book just throws you right into the thick of conflict resolution.
It does, right. And what I find refreshing is that Adler doesn't try to sugarcoat anything. He goes straight into these huge, complex problems we're facing: climate change, political polarization, resource scarcity, basically saying, get ready because these problems aren't going away.
He's saying conflict is unavoidable, so we better get good at dealing with it.
Yeah. And he even says that these massive, complicated issues can actually be catalysts for good change, which is a pretty different way to think about it, isn't it?
It is. So how does he explain that? Because it sounds a little crazy at first.
He uses the example of the 1905 Russo-Japanese War. Now, it goes without saying that war is a terrible thing, but Adler's point is that even with all the tragedy, this particular conflict sparked some really significant changes.
Okay, I'm interested. Like what?
Well, for Russia, the war showed some major problems in their military and government. It forced them to deal with those problems head on and finally led to some big modernization efforts. And then there's Ireland, which saw a huge increase in nationalist feelings and a push for unification directly because of the war. Even the beginning of a Jewish homeland started during this time. Jewish communities, especially in Russia, were facing more and more persecution.
So it's kind of like the butterfly effect. One event, even a devastating one, can set off a chain reaction of unexpected outcomes, and some of them might actually be good.
That's it. It's not about thinking conflict is a good thing, but about understanding that even negative events can have ripple effects, sometimes pushing us towards progress in ways we never would have thought of.
Which makes me think about that Papua New Guinea example you mentioned, the OK Teddy mine. It seems like a totally different situation, but it also shows this idea of unexpected outcomes.
Totally. That case study is a perfect example of how complex environmental problems usually involve a bunch of different people and groups with their own viewpoints and priorities. Adler emphasizes that to solve conflicts in these situations, you really need to understand those relationships and power dynamics. You can't just come in with a one-size-fits-all solution.
It's like trying to do a puzzle without looking at all the pieces. You need the whole picture to even start finding where they fit.
Exactly. And that's where Adler's idea of the independent zone comes in. He says we need to move past this us against them way of thinking. We need to get to a place where we're truly trying to understand the other side's viewpoint, their view plane, as he calls it.
So it's not about agreeing with them, but about really getting where they're coming from.
Precisely. It's about recognizing that conflict often comes from different ways of seeing things, not just from being opposed to each other.
And that connects to his point about understanding that power is fluid, right? It's not always about who's in charge, but about how influence can change depending on what's happening.
Exactly. He uses a really interesting example of this NASA's Project Prometheus, a nuclear-powered spacecraft.
I remember that. Did they eventually scrap it because the public was worried about the risks?
You got it. Even though the project had huge scientific potential, the public's concern about launching radioactive material into space made NASA rethink things.
So even a powerful organization like NASA had to acknowledge and respond to what everyday citizens were concerned about.
It shows how complicated power dynamics can be and how important it is to recognize the power of every person or group involved, no matter their perceived status.
You're reminding me of something else. Adler talks about this idea of shifting from focusing only on individual positions to understanding the needs and satisfactions underneath. Can you say more about that?
Absolutely. He says that instead of getting stuck on who's right or wrong, we have to dig deeper. We need to uncover what's really at the root of the conflict, the needs and desires that are driving what each side wants.
It's like that saying, don't focus on winning the argument. Focus on understanding the other person.
Exactly. And sometimes just by understanding those core needs, you can find creative solutions that work for everyone involved, solutions that you wouldn't have even considered when you were stuck in that me versus you mindset.
He calls this finding the tertium quid, right? The third thing, a solution that goes beyond those initial points of conflict.
That's it. It's about moving past the limitations of those first positions and working together to create something new that benefits everybody.
It's like instead of arguing over how to split a pie, you figure out a way to bake a bigger pie so everyone gets more. It sounds like a much more satisfying way to approach things, don't you think?
Totally. And it all comes back to that shift in perspective. We talked about moving away from a win-lose mindset and embracing a more collaborative approach that focuses on solutions.
It makes you realize that conflict, as uncomfortable as it can also be a huge opportunity for growth and innovation, if we approach it with the right mindset and the right tools.
It really is. And speaking of finding that third thing, sometimes the key is having the right team. Adler says that building high-performing teams isn't just about getting a bunch of talented people together. It's about creating something where the whole is greater than the parts.
He uses a really interesting comparison to explain this, doesn't he? Something about wolves.
Yeah, he does. Adler points out that a lone wolf might be strong, but a pack of wolves working together can do so much more. In the same way, when it comes to solving conflicts, it's often the team with the right mix of skills, perspectives, and personalities that's best at handling those tough challenges.
So it's not just about individual brilliance. It's about how those individuals work together towards a shared objective.
Exactly. A great example of this is the 1980 U.S. Olympic hockey team. Their coach, Herb Brooks, totally got this.
Yeah.
He didn't just pick the most naturally gifted players, he picked people who he thought would work well together, players who were eager to learn and grow as a team.
And they ended up pulling off one of the biggest upsets in sports history, beating the Soviet team who everyone thought was unbeatable.
Exactly. It just shows how powerful teamwork can be, how sometimes the best way to overcome a challenge is to use the combined strengths of a diverse group of people.
It's a good reminder that we can do amazing things when we work together and use our unique skills and perspectives to our advantage.
Absolutely. And speaking of working together, one of the most important skills in conflict resolution and teamwork is listening.
It's not just about waiting for our turn to talk, right?
Right. Adler emphasizes how important it is to really listen to understand, not just to get ready to reply. It's about putting aside our own biases and really trying to see things from the other person's perspective.
That sounds simple enough, but I bet it's a lot tougher to do when emotions are running high.
It takes effort and self-awareness. But the payoff can be huge. When people feel like they've been heard and understood, it builds trust and respect, which makes it easier to have productive talks and ultimately find solutions that work.
I'm thinking of that story about Judge Noah Sweat's speech to the Mississippi legislature about legalizing liquor. It seems like a kind of out there example, but it really shows how powerful listening and empathy can be.
It does. Legalizing liquor had been a big debate in Mississippi for decades. But Judge Sweat, who is known for his wit and intelligence, was able to cut through all that by acknowledging what both sides of the argument were concerned about. He didn't avoid the complexities of the issue. Instead, he used humor and storytelling to help people connect with each other and understand where the other side was coming from.
It's amazing how a good story or a little humor can disarm people and make them more open to other perspectives.
Absolutely, and that's another key point Adler makes. Just having facts isn't always enough to resolve a conflict. We need to understand how people see those facts, how they feel about them.
He talks about how important it is to navigate risk perception, right? Because something that seems like a small risk to one person could feel like a huge deal to someone else.
Exactly, and those perceptions usually come from our personal experiences, our values, and what we believe. So to really resolve conflict, we have to be sensitive to those things and adjust how we communicate based on who we're talking to.
The example that comes to mind is the disagreement between the Clackamas tribe and the American Museum of Natural History over the Willamette meteorite. You've got a scientific institution that focuses on research and preservation, and a Native American tribe that sees the meteorite as culturally and spiritually significant. It's like two totally different ways of looking at the world.
It really was. But instead of getting stuck in a legal battle over who owned the meteorite, they found a way to respect both sides. The museum kept the meteorite, acknowledging how important it was for science, but they also recognized the tribe's cultural connection, letting them hold ceremonies at the museum and even involving them in making educational materials.
It's a great example of how, even when there are big differences, we can find solutions that work for everyone when we try to understand and respect each other's needs and values.
It really is. And it shows how much trust matters in conflict resolution. When people come to the table wanting to work together, listen to each other, and find creative solutions, great things can happen.
Since we're talking about trust, I want to hear more about Adler's ideas on ethical leadership. It seems like that's a big part of building and keeping trust, both between people and in larger groups.
Absolutely. Adler says that ethical leadership is the foundation of good conflict resolution. When leaders consistently show that they're honest, transparent, and fair, it builds trust. And that trust lets people talk more openly and work together better.
He uses a really interesting historical example to show this, right? Something about the Iroquois Confederacy.
That's right. The Iroquois Confederacy was a union of 6 Native American nations. They had this amazing system of government built on shared values, making decisions together, and respecting nature. Their Great Binding Law, which was a set of rules that they followed for centuries, shows just how committed they were to peace and working together.
It sounds like they were way ahead of their time when it comes to understanding how to govern effectively and resolve conflicts. What can we learn from them today, especially now when things feel so divided?
That's a great question. One of the biggest takeaways from the Iroquois Confederacy is the importance of having shared values and a common purpose. They knew that by focusing on what brings us together instead of what separates us, we can do incredible things. Their system of government was all about working together, finding consensus, and respecting everyone's point of view.
And that goes back to Adler's idea about creating those safe haven spaces for dialogue, right? Places where people can come together, put their differences aside, and have open and honest conversations.
Exactly. These safe havens can be anything from casual get-togethers to more formal mediation sessions. The important thing is that they're neutral ground where everyone feels heard, respected, and able to share what they think without being judged or criticized.
It reminds me of another story from the book about the Gang of 14 in the U.S. Senate. You have this group of senators from both parties who came together during a really politically charged time to try and find some middle ground on a really divisive issue.
It's a perfect example of how, even in the most divided situations, making space for dialogue and collaboration can lead to real breakthroughs. By putting their differences aside and focusing on what they all agreed on, which was wanting to avoid a political crisis, the Gang of 14 found a solution that nobody thought was possible.
It shows us that we don't have to be stuck in these endless cycles of fighting and gridlock. There are ways to overcome those divides, find some common ground, and work together to build a better future.
Absolutely. And sometimes that means being strategic and thoughtful, what Adler calls the choreography of negotiation.
Choreography.
Yeah.
It sounds like we're talking about a dance instead of a negotiation.
In a way, we are. Just like a choreographer carefully plans out the movements of dancers to make a performance that's both beautiful and powerful, skilled negotiators think strategically about how a conversation flows, when to make certain points, and how to create moments that foster connection and understanding.
So it's not just about going with the flow. There's real skill in setting up a productive dialogue, creating an atmosphere where people are ready to listen and find common ground.
Exactly. That might mean being really intentional about who's involved, setting clear ground rules, or even using visual aids or metaphors to help people understand complex ideas. It's about paying attention to both what we say and how we say it.
Adler uses another interesting term in his book, mugwumpery. It sounds a bit like something from a fantasy novel. What exactly does it mean?
It does have a ring to it, right? But it actually describes those individuals who are willing to cross political lines, question the way things are, and step up as impartial mediators, even if it means going against their own side or facing backlash.
They're like the peacemakers, the ones who are willing to walk into that uncomfortable middle ground and connect with people who see things differently.
That's a great way to put it. And Adler says that these mugwumps are often the ones who help resolve conflict. They're not afraid to stand up for what they believe in, even when it's hard, and their willingness to listen, empathize, and find common ground can be incredibly disarming and effective.
It's really inspiring to think that we all have the potential to be mugwumps in our own ways, to be the ones who are willing to bridge those gaps and work with others to find solutions.
It really is. And that leads us to one of the most important messages from Adler's book. While leaders have a huge influence on how things turn out, it's ultimately up to each of us to be the heroes of our own stories when it comes to resolving conflict.
So we can't just wait around for someone else to come and fix everything. We have to recognize our own power and take responsibility for creating the kind of world we want to live in.
Exactly. Every single one of us has the power to make a difference, to choose bravery over comfort, to really listen to understand, to share our own truths respectfully, and to look for solutions that benefit everyone.
It's a powerful call to action, a reminder that even when we're surrounded by conflict, we always have a choice. We can choose hope, we can choose to work together, and we can choose to build a better future. And on that note of hope and empowerment, we'll wrap up this deep dive into calming the storm. Thanks for joining us on this exploration. Until next time, keep those conversations going, keep your minds open, and remember, we're all in this together.